Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAM. Welcome to another edition of our Heart to Heart series. Today we're going to talk about the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine related crimes at the federal level. I'm excited for our guests. I'm going to introduce them briefly now. Heather Rice-Minus is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Church Mobilization at Prison Fellowship. Matthew Charles is a FAM Justice Fellow and is probably better known as the first beneficiary of the First Step Act and guest of the presidents at the State of the Union a few years back. And Jared Blassingame, who is the Executive Director of Soteria Community Development Corporation in South Carolina. I just want to open by saying FAM has known and been concerned about the disparity in treatment between crack and powder cocaine related crimes at the federal level for many years. Ever since the law was passed in '86, the Sentencing Commission and others have been raising concern about the disparity and its impact, particularly in the Black community. And there have been, especially since last summer, a great focus on how discrimination rears its head in the criminal justice system. And some of those ways are hard to root out because they're found in the human heart or brain, and they manifest themselves through implicit bias and other things. But some forms of discrimination are, so to speak, in black and white, and they're in the code itself. A good example of that is drug-free school zones and the way those laws are applied. But there's perhaps none more obnoxious than the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, two drugs, one drug treated differently under the law, and that has caused enormous damage over the years. And so we recently launched an End the Disparity campaign with Prison Fellowship. And our goal is to eliminate the disparity in treatment between crack and powder at the federal level to zero. We want a 1-to-1 ratio, no longer the 18-to-1 that we have currently. And we believe this is a matter of both racial justice and criminal justice reform. And we think it's doable. We were really heartened recently when the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, designate Attorney General, testified and said that the Biden administration would support 1-to-1. And we are seeing more and more people join this cause. And this week, Prison Fellowship and FAM are meeting with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, Republicans, Democrats, anyone willing to listen, bringing affected families and faith leaders to Congress to let them know that they want this change made. And so I want to jump right into the discussion and start with you, Heather. And I first want to start because I know this is being live streamed at Prison Fellowship and FAM and then publicly. Tell us about Prison Fellowship, though, if people aren't familiar. What does Prison Fellowship do, and what is your work?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. I'm really excited to be here and to be partnering with FAM on this campaign to end the disparity. Prison Fellowship is the nation's largest Christian nonprofit that serves people in prison, their families, and those who are coming home from prison as well. And we're also a leading advocate for justice reform, and we've been involved in this work for over 40 years. We were founded by the late Chuck Colson and continue to be active at the federal and state level in advocating for justice reforms that are aligned with a restorative approach to justice, which we believe is what we're called to do as Christians.
That's awesome. And obviously, we've partnered together a lot on these issues. And so I'm well aware of your work, and we're grateful for your partnership. Can you set the table for this discussion by talking about what is the disparity, how did we get here, and lead us to today, what we're fighting for?
Sure. So, when we look back in the 80s and 90s, there was certainly a different sentiment about justice reform. We were reforming, but not in the direction we would hope for today at FAM and Prison Fellowship, right? So in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act put in place the infamous 100-to-1 penalty. Essentially, 500 grams of powder cocaine was punished at the same level as 5 grams of crack cocaine. And so that disparity existed. At the time, people were concerned about drug use. The use of crack cocaine, is believed at the time to be to cause more violence in communities, to be highly addictive. And decades later, a lot more research and data came out showing us that In fact, these really were two forms of the same drug. It was not causing more violence in these communities. However, there was a terrible, terrible toll, particularly in communities of color in the Black community. At the time, crack cocaine definitely more available and to be made cheaper, and so we saw more marginalized communities were really hit hardest with these penalties. But we didn't see Congress take action on that for decades. It wasn't until 2010, thanks to a really large and robust and diverse coalition that included our organizations, that the disparity was brought down to 18-1. And now, over a decade later, that disparity is still a disparity. And it's time to clean up some loose ends. And while I think lots of folks have hopes, including us, for a lot more when it comes to justice reform and addressing racial justice, we need to clean this up, and we believe it's the right thing to do. And so there is legislation that's been introduced, the Equal Act by Senators Cory Booker and Dick Durbin in the Senate. We're expecting a bipartisan companion of that bill to be introduced in the House next week. And so as you mentioned, Kevin, we've got FAM advocates and prison fellowship, ambassadors and faith leaders meeting with their lawmakers this week, sharing why they think the Equal Act is so important to get done right away in 2021.
Thanks. Matthew, this is not an academic exercise to you. You were watching these reforms take place, especially at the end, from a prison cell, and very much interested in the outcome of this. So if there's anybody out there who doesn't know who Matthew Charles is, can you tell them a little bit about your story and how you were personally impacted by the disparity?
Okay, thanks, Kevin. My name is Matthew Charles. I was arrested in 1995 for selling crack cocaine. And in 1996, I ended up receiving a 35-year sentence because at the time it was a 100-to-1 ratio. And in doing so, my sentencing guideline range based on my criminal history, fell in criminal history category 6 with a sentencing range of 30 years to life. And I was given a 35-year sentence. But had it been at a 1-to-1 ratio, I would have failed at base offense level 18 because it correlates directly to the base offense level for powder cocaine. But anyway, I was given a 35-year sentence. I was serving that sentence. And in the process of serving that sentence, in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act came out, and it, as Heather has stated and Kevin as well, it lowered the crack cocaine ratio from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. Well, in doing so, it made me eligible for a sentence reduction. So I filed a petition. That petition was granted, and I was released shortly thereafter. But my case was appealed by the prosecutor because he stated that it didn't apply to me because that bill was not made fully retroactive, and it wasn't. So therefore, I was ordered to return back to prison to serve an additional 10 years that was still remaining on my sentence, since I had already served 21 and a half years, day for day prior to that release. So in the process of me going back, I was arrested, went back, held over at the county jail for about 7 months, and then the First Step Act passed, which was also bipartisan legislation signed by President Trump. So once that bill was signed, my public defenders filed a petition with the district court asking me to be released, since now it was made retroactive. And on January 3rd, I was released, being the first person released under the First Step Act, because the First Step Act had an amendment in it that made retroactive those 2010 changes. So therefore, because I was directly impacted by the crack cocaine offense, the crack cocaine outweighed all the other offenses that I actually had. It caused me to have anywhere from a 17 to a 20-year increase in sentence.
Tell us about that. I mean, just from your perspective, I mean, getting a harsher sentence because of the type of drug you sold. I mean, did that always seem unfair to you, or how did you feel about that?
It definitely, like I said, when I was incarcerated, I actually worked in a law library, so I was able to understand it a little bit more than some of the people that were, being arrested for it. But at the same time, when I initially got arrested, we know that, like I said, in 1986, it was changed to 101 because there was fear of this drug. It was unknown, you know what I mean, the extent of this drug, the addictiveness. And like I said, a lot of people equated violence to it. Well, 2 decades later, 24 years later, in 2010, when it was addressed again, they was able to understand that all those things that they had feared was not necessarily attached to this drug, because it's two drugs, you know, of the same form. So by me being incarcerated for that period of time for crack cocaine, seeing people come in with other offenses such as powder cocaine and marijuana offenses, but my sentence is significantly higher. And those that were around me had anywhere from what I had, which was a 30, 35-year sentence, to 50 years, 60 years in life sentences, based solely on the disparity between those two drug types. And as you stated, you know, from the beginning, Kevin, we know that you know, when it comes to racial inequality, the fact that this is the type of drug that was being sold in the communities of color and being utilized by people of color. And then you had powder cocaine, which Heather also stated was a little bit more expensive and also sold in some of the outward communities, but yet it took 5 grams of powder cocaine to equate to what 500 grams of crack cocaine equated to. So that automatically, you know, like, so you see the not only racial injustice, but also, as you stated, the fact that it's a, you know, criminal, you know, as far as us needing to address this from a status of criminal justice reform. Because whenever we look to the law, we can directly see, whenever we look at the ratio between the two drug types, why such a ratio exists. And once we look at it, we understand why it existed in 1986. But we're in the 21st century now with a lot better understanding on how we approach, you know, dealing with, you know, people with drug issues, including treatment, you know, diversionary treatment, as well as trying to equate the one-to-one with the powder cocaine to the crack cocaine, because now we understand that everything that we feared in the past and thought that we knew scientifically was incorrect.
Yeah. Jerry, I want to bring you in. You've also experienced incarceration, and now you're a faith leader and a reentry provider in your community. How have you seen the disparity have an impact in your community?
Yeah, well, Kevin, thank you so much for having me on. And because I've been doing reentry work for 22 years, not only reentry, but we've been able to fuse community development and reentry. So we deal with the community and families. So when a person who was sentenced in the 90s was sentenced to 20 years or 30 years for crack cocaine, and they had small children, their children are adults who are being incarcerated now. And so I look at the family, because the family is the basis of our community, especially as a faith community. The family build up the church and make up the church. And so my big problem is we punishing people who are, you know, African Americans and Black and brown people in our poor communities already. Now the children and the families are suffering. And so that is the biggest thing that I've seen. So this is the way that it has impacted. You talk about economic mobility. When children can't get out of poverty because they don't have the education or the resources. So we have a bigger problem than we talk about. You know, we talk about inequalities, you know, when it comes to African Americans and Black and brown people. So I want to see us think about this issue, level the playing field so that men can get out of prison and take care of their kids, or not even go, and make that the punishment be proportionate to the crime. You know, there's no way that a person should get 30 years or 20 years for selling one crack or getting a possession of 5 grams of crack. There, you know, it's just crazy when you got somebody who's a non-Black person who may have more, do 2 or 3 years or 5 years. You know, already we're behind African Americans. We're behind when it comes to the economy. You know, a lot of us we don't have home ownership. So we have no equity in the community. So in order for, I believe, for America to be a better place, we got to level the playing field when it comes to economics as well, so that people who are Black and brown can get out and work and be able to help build the community. So this is the way I've seen it played out, you know, from being in this work every day and seeing men get out of prison and not being able to take care of their children. Then their children go sell drugs because they can't get a job. And so I don't, you know, we always talk about users, but we never talk about the reason that some young Black men are on the corner selling drugs is because they have no other opportunity. I am not advocating for people to sell drugs. I'm advocating that we help poor communities when it comes to economic mobility and create jobs in those communities.
I want to ask you something because FAM focuses mostly on sentencing, and a lot of folks, groups and advocates and then on the ground groups like yours are working on reentry. And I always say those are connected more than people think, because if you've served a 20 or 30-year sentence, the reentry is so much harder because the job market has passed you by, technology has passed you by, your family might have moved on. Can you talk about the impact of long sentences and what you've seen that do to people?
Oh, yes. Even during COVID, over the last year, we had a couple men who had completed 20-year sentences, and they got out and they came to our program. They were oblivious to cell phones, oblivious to how to use a computer. Job search is all on computers now. Learning how to drive again. I had one guy, he finally got his driver's license and he had a couple wrecks. He just could not get his bearings right. You think about driving, thinking about going to a self-checkout line in a grocery store. These are things, we take those things for granted. Everything's on debit card right now. Cash out. All of these cashless systems. So people are way behind, and there's nothing in the prison systems that, that we're teaching to help people to get caught up. Going to schools, helping a child with their homework. Every father want to get out of prison and go to school to help, with a child's homework. It's just hard because all of the kids are using Chromebooks now in school. So how can you help your kid, do homework when you don't understand what is a Chromebook? What is Google? And so I've seen it, that's just practical things. But mentally, it's just so much. I've seen guys have so much anxiety from being in crowds, not being able to go out and, everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's looking down. And a lot of these guys have anxiety. And the average person, we don't think about that. Credit, being able to get back into the banking system and, just all of the things that the average American citizen don't understand reentry and what it takes for a person to get out of prison after doing 20 or 30 years to be a productive citizen again. And we give people these long sentences and we say, okay, go do well, with no resources. And so I'm thankful that organizations like Soteria, we're helping people with housing, education, employment, mentoring, all of the things that, an average person will need to acclimate themselves back to society.
I was going to say something else, but Matthew, I want to bring you up because of housing. Matthew was the poster child for second chances because he had served 21 years, no infractions. His case got national attention because he was released and then they sent him back. He was a guest at the State of the Union, but then he couldn't find housing himself. Matthew, can you talk a little bit about that? I know that was a terrible time, but I just think it just shows like how hard it is for people to land on their feet.
Yes, it is difficult. Just like Jared was stating, the fact that after you've been in 20 years, and because oftentimes whenever you go fill out that application for housing, whether it be through a rental agency or likewise, you run into all type of barriers. The barriers that I ran into were not only the fact that, like I said, I had to check the box or put on it I was a prior felon, but also because there's really no credit history. You know what I mean? The fact that this, landlord or homeowner is want to rent to somebody that they believe that they can trust and actually is going to pay the rent, on time. So therefore, when I filled out several applications, I just consistently got denied. But the thing that really is, contradictory is each time I fill out an application, sometimes I'm paying $40 or $50 to get denied. As I'm filling out the application, I already know that I'm gonna be denied. I mean, it's like putting your, prison ID number in place of your name on the form, because they're not going to contact you, and when they do contact you, you're going to be denied, but you're not getting that, rent application feedback. So I ran into all type of, problems and things of that nature. And thankfully I had some friends that were able to step up, as we, maybe familiar. Kim Kardashian actually, stated, will somebody take a chance and rent to my friend? And the reason I'm bringing this out is because I want to show you the first example before I get to the second. But she had stated, prior to that, just go and tell whatever the landlord, or homeowner it was, that you would call me and I would speak and say I would co-sign for you and pay the rent for 5 years. So we went to a place on Buchanan Street here in Nashville, Tennessee, and found the place. And I had a Gabriel Vitek, who was a good friend of mine, who was a rent, specialist. He actually was, coordinating and working it out for me. So we went and we thought we had an agreement with the rental agency and everything. And we thought that that was going to be the place for me. But once the owner of the resident found out that I was a felon, he was like, no, I'm not going to rent to him, even with us telling him that additional information that I just shared. So after we re-informed Kim about it, she tweeted about it herself. And once she tweeted about it, it was like the heavens opened and the rains poured. You know what I mean? People were just offering, a place to stay because she had tweeted it herself. So therefore, I was able to secure a place based on her still co-signing for me, but in a different way. But a lot of people don't have that help. And that's the problem. And the fact that we know that, over 95% of people, around 97% of people that are incarcerated are going to be returned back into society if they don't have a death sentence or a life sentence. And we can't even say if they have a life sentence because we've seen people get out that does have life sentences. So once they return to their community, they're going to need, like Jerry's organization, they're going to need other organizations that say, hey, we know that because I served 22 years myself, 21 and a half before I was sent back the additional time, totaling 22. So therefore, we need these organizations out there that says, we're going to help you get a secure footing. We know that you're already disadvantaged, but it's a sad thing when you disadvantaged because you served a significant amount of time in prison, but it's also a sad thing when that additional time that you served in prison came from the disparity attached to the two drug types. So it's like a no-win situation. But when it comes to housing, as I stated, there's barriers to it because you don't have any credit history. Another thing that I sometimes share is the fact that I was able to purchase a vehicle. And when I went to get the vehicle, because I didn't have any credit, I had to do on-lot financing. And I was actually almost charged close to $3,000 extra in interest payment for that vehicle because I didn't have any credit history. So, like I said, there's those things that you have to, wade through, walk through and work out. But at the same token, some of those barriers shouldn't exist. But whenever you look at the people that are serving these extensive long sentences, we're just like Jared stated, just like, the family organization and prison fellowship, we understand that people commit crimes and need to be incarcerated. But we just want that person to have an appropriate sentence, a fair sentence. And because the disparity between the two drug types, where both of them are the actual form, and the things that we thought that were associated to one have been found to be incorrect, we need to just do all that we can to see that we're able to right that wrong so that people don't have to serve this tremendous amount of time behind bars unnecessarily, clearly because of a misunderstanding of the two drug types and the excessive sentence attached to it.
Yeah, I think that it sounds like I'm taking us down a rabbit hole about housing and reentry. It's just that it's important that people see how mass incarceration, or whatever you call it, affects society in deeper ways. And you've had sociologists on the left to the right, including, I remember Speaker Paul Ryan, talking about how our over-incarceration leads to intergenerational poverty. And I think, you both are talking about that. And we can't get away from that. And so if we have laws that not only over-punish people, but harm specific communities, it is going to be harder to ever level the playing field. Heather, I want to move to a little bit more to the contemporary part of this debate, and Matthew just alluded to it. We go to the Hill, and the first thing people say, even like online, if you're brave enough to read comments like on our op-ed, and it's, do the time, do the crime, do the time. Well, why? What's wrong with that idea that, Matthew didn't want to serve that time, he shouldn't have committed a crime? What do you, what's the answer?
Well, I think Matthew just said something super poignant, which is, we're not saying people shouldn't do time if the crime merits doing time. What we are saying is that time should be proportional. It should be a just and fair sentence. And in this case, I believe that the sentencing scheme for crack cocaine is disproportional. And we can see that it's had a tremendous impact on communities of color that has been negative. We can also see that looking back, the U.S. Sentencing Commission has done, some studies and reports of did this work, in the way that it was intended. We know that people who are released earlier, who benefited from the Fair Sentencing Act, they do not recidivate at higher rates than those who serve the full time. We know that crack cocaine, in terms of distribution, did not decrease as a result of this, which, I think a lot of people hope that harsher penalties will be a deterrent effect. And so every time we sentence someone, I think, we've gotten in the habit in the United States, our go-to form of punishment is incarceration. We have lost track of how long a year, 5 year, 10 years is, and that impact that has in someone's life. And we can hold people accountable in a proportional way for drug dealing. We're not trying to say it does not harm communities. It certainly does, and there needs to be accountability for that. But that accountability needs to be proportional. And the Equal Act and bringing down the disparity in how we hold people accountable for crack versus powder cocaine is a great next step. We can't hear you, Kevin.
Thank you. Darn it. See, I mute myself and then I forget. I don't have somebody from the other side on this, but could you help by just explain, like, I try to be as charitable as I can to like what another side's view is that's disagreeing with me. On this one, I have a hard time. What opposition are we going to run into? Do you think? What are the interests on the other side that say, oh no, we have to keep this disparity? I mean, what can you say?
So I do run into it. Some of the things that we've heard, at Prison Fellowship, we're even working on finalizing a Mythbuster document for this reason, because there are still arguments out there, and a lot of them still stem from the exact same arguments you heard in the 80s. So one thing we've been addressing with folks is, and we've been hearing is that, crack cocaine is more addictive than powder cocaine. So therefore it should be punished more harshly. And, the U.S. Sentencing Commission has done reports on this. Neither form of drug is more addictive in and of itself. That said, I think, it's important to have the discussion for folks who are questioning that or reading something related to that. What they're seeing is that the method in which someone intakes that drug can have a differing effect. So, powder cocaine, which is more often snorted, versus, going directly to your bloodstream, with crack cocaine, or other forms of how we're ingesting it. That is sometimes giving people a quicker high. And so, there are folks who then characterize that as more addictive. The method in which someone's using it can lead to quicker high, but not the drug itself. There's also other variables that make someone's high stronger. Your whether or not you're drinking alcohol at the time, mental illness can play a factor. All these other variables can play a factor, and to quantify that would be next to impossible. And even if we could quantify that and then punish people accordingly, we would argue we shouldn't do that, because we have seen that not only has punishing crack cocaine more harshly not led to a reduction in crack distribution, it's not having people recidivate at lower rates, so it's not having that deterrent effect that people think it will, and it's having this incredibly negative effect on the Black community and other communities of color. We would argue that that's not an appropriate response. But that's really the main one I have heard, Kevin.
Yeah, and I think what people need to know too is that when part of the reason the Congress acted in 2010 was to reduce the totally disproportionate conviction rate of Black and whites related to this drug, but back then it was 81% of the people convicted for crack cocaine offenses and receiving these harsher sentences were Black. And even after the disparity was reduced to 18-1, as late as 2019, we're still seeing 81% of the people convicted of crack offenses are Black. And so we really have done nothing to reduce, sort of that disparity in who's being charged and convicted of these crimes. Jerry, I want to ask you this question. I'm white. That's not going to come as a newsflash to anyone watching, but it's easy for me to see why people lose trust in the justice system. I mean, I went through the system myself. I have my own problems with it. For a person of color to see that the law, knowing that people are treated differently for using one type of drug that's associated with one community, what do you think that impact is? I mean, I have my own sense. I can guess that would feel like we're created this unequal system of justice. But what does it feel like for you when you recognize that federal law still allows for this disparate treatment?
Oh God, that's embarrassing to our country, to see that we're still here. And even over the last few years, we've seen what happened in our country. Now we're looking at this drugs. It's just it's so hurtful, and I'm still seeing it. Personally, I've experienced it. People in the community where my office is, we see it every day. And one of the things that we don't talk about, because of these disparities, the over policing in our neighborhoods. There's just so I live on the east side of town, predominantly white neighborhood. I barely see a police car in my neighborhood, maybe 1 or 2 a month. Every 12 or 13 seconds in the neighborhood where my office is, I'm seeing a police car. And I've had conversations, about that. And, they're saying, well, because people are calling the police more. No, people are not calling the police more. It's just the police are here. And it's almost like harassment. And I know people say, Jerry, no, but it is. Why are you in our neighborhoods? Come do good. I always tell people this. I love Andy Griffith. Andy Griffith was a type of police. He walked around with no gun. He knew everybody's name. If we could get back to that type, because I'm not anti-police. I believe in punishment. I respect my children. But one thing I believe that when we punish people without a relationship, we create rebellion. And that's what's going on in our inner cities. There's a lot of rebellion. And I've been rebellious as a young Black man in my inner city neighborhood. I had no idea what the police were for. You're talking about serve and protect. Y'all not serve and protecting me. You're harassing me. You don't even know my name. You're running me off the corner asking me what I'm doing here. So I wish we could get to a place where, we could be humans again. Let's be humans again. And so that's kind of my feelings when it comes. And I probably asked for more than I probably gave you more than you asked for, but that's
no. I appreciate it. And sometimes I'm the cranky old man who wants to go back to Andy Griffith, but I'm glad somebody else is. Yeah. We got a question. Somebody said, will this change? Will this be retroactive if they pass the disparity law? And the bill, as it stands now, would make the 1-to-1 retroactive. Matthew, can you talk about the importance of retroactivity? Because people don't realize that the default, when the states and the federal government usually pass reform, they don't make them retroactive. And I think it's for fear of letting people out. But can you talk about retroactivity?
Okay. When it comes to retroactivity at the federal level, oftentimes, even when the United States Supreme Court makes a ruling, if they don't explicitly state in that ruling that it's retroactive, then forget how it used to be in the past where it fell up under the umbrella clause and everybody was able to benefit from it. If they don't state that it's retroactive, it's not retroactive. When it comes to the United States sentencing guidelines, the United States Sentencing Commission has the authority to make any law or bill a retroactive that Congress failed to state in it that it already was retroactive. And it's funny because when it comes to retroactivity, I'm a champion of that because the Fair Sentencing Act was not made retroactive that I had to return to serve that additional 10 years. But even because whenever a bill is passed and is not made retroactive, I think it does a grave harm due to the fact, but Kevin has already stated, so I don't want to, confuse anybody, that the bill that's being offered up does have a retroactivity of application in it. But when it doesn't, it's like the people that you utilize to show how wrong the system did to these people or how wrong that they're currently being done, but yet they're not able to benefit from it because it's not made retroactive. It's like, I don't want to say it's like a slap in the face, maybe on one side of the face, not on both sides. And the reason I state that is because in 2010, when the law changed, making it not making it retroactive, but changing it from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. We welcomed that change because that meant that the door was closed on people coming in with the 100-to-1. That needed to be closed. So anybody that was serving time, I would say under the 100-to-1 ratio, when that changed, was happy to see that change. We were unhappy about it not being made retroactive because it didn't reach us just yet. But we need things to stop, so that later on we pray and hope that it will be made retroactive. But when things are not made retroactive because it was 2010 when the Fair Sentencing Act passed. It was in 2018 when the First Step Act passed, and the First Step Act actually had an amendment making retroactive those 2010 changes. So here it is, we had to wait 8 additional years to benefit from something that we were the ones that was presented to the legislators as having been done the greatest harm and wrong to. But when it comes to retroactivity, I believe that it's always necessary because sometimes I use an analogy that's probably not an appropriate one. Definitely not, taken away from slavery and the plight of those that were, under such a system. But it's like saying to a slave that we're no longer going to make slaves, but because you're already a slave, we'll just keep you as one. And I'm sorry if that's offensive to anybody, but that's my, mental rationale of how you do it. Because if you're saying that this is wrong and we want to make it right, but because we're making it right after you had already been done wrong, it doesn't apply to you. So retroactive application is very important to be, especially when it's such as, like I said, dealing with the disparity that should not have ever existed. But we understand why in 1986 it was made 100-1. We understood that the media played a part. We understand that the movie industry played a part. We understand that the legislators played their part. And I'm just hoping that now in 2010, when everybody came to the round table and said, hey, we got it wrong, you know what I mean? And they were willing to, work a political compromise. They were willing, society, do a compromise and say, okay, we'll make it 18-1 because that is a great jump from where we're at. But it still is the difference between anywhere from 5 to 12 years for some people, being at 18-1 as opposed to 1-1.
Yeah.
Everybody, whenever it's 1-1, you have a lot of people asking me whether they fall on the sentencing guidelines if it is 1-1. Well, I just try to advise them and tell them, go and see what your offense would have carried if it carried for powder cocaine. And that's the sentence you would have received.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting time too, because we're talking about 1986, and one of the main architects of those policies is now President of the United States, Joe Biden. And we've seen in the First Step Act, in the Fair Sentencing Act, efforts to tear down some of the system that was built in the 80s and 90s, and this would be another step in that. I want to ask, somebody asked a question in the group about their loved one was charged with conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine. This bill obviously would not affect that because this deals only with crack. I just want to say, because we actually get a lot of questions about methamphetamine, and people don't realize it is the most harshly punished drug now in the system. Because a while back, Congress, and I was working on the Hill in part of this effort, Congress, when methamphetamine became the drug that everybody was scared of, it had a moment like the crack scare. They changed the penalties for methamphetamine. So now methamphetamine, 5 grams gets you 5 years. So now it's even a stiffer penalty than crack cocaine. That needs to change. I'm not going to speak for prison fellowship, but I can tell you that at FAM, we absolutely do not think that the triggers for federal mandatory minimums should be what they are for methamphetamine, and that is something we need to change. I just want to say this bill doesn't affect it, but stay tuned on that. Because I have the 3 of you here and you all share faith, I want to just ask you about that, because I won't be the first one to notice that sometimes people in the Christian community can be the toughest on crime. Because maybe there's a sense of, well, God will sort it out later, but for now, this is earthly justice, and you're going to pay the price for maybe doing something that you shouldn't have done. But I want to talk about how you all briefly see how your faith informs your position on matters of criminal justice, because there's an expression like there's no atheists in foxholes, right? I mean, and my experience was there are not a lot of atheists in prison either. And people hold on to their faith to give them strength to get through that experience. And I know a lot of family members rely on their faith to help them while their loved one's gone. And I'm hopeful that people who share that faith can be more empathetic then to what that person's going through. So Heather, I'll start with you, but just talk about how your faith maybe informs your work on this.
Sure. Actually, part of why I came to Prison Fellowship. We've been here for over 8 years now, but I was working for another nonprofit, and we worked with, variety of people of different faith, and I became kind of the resident evangelical. And I was often asked, why do conservatives think this way, and what should we do about this? And it was my first time, really having my eyes open to the justice system and all that was wrong with it. And I started to see that, like you just said, Kevin, a lot of times the folks who are the most resistant, particularly to sentencing reform, shared my faith. And it made me want to work somewhere that I felt could be influential to those same members of Congress or in the states. And I started partnering with Prison Fellowship in my work, and just thought, I knew of the legacy of Chuck Colson. For those of you watching who don't know, Chuck Colson, he was actually part of the Nixon administration. He was known as the Hatchet Man. And then when he was caught up in the Watergate scandal, he really had a come to Jesus moment, if you will, and gave his life to Christ. And then when he went into prison, he really got to know the men inside. And they said, you're just going to forget us. If any politician does come in here, they forget us when they leave. And he promised he wouldn't do that. And that's when he got out. That's when he founded Prison Fellowship. He spent the rest of his life visiting men and women in prison, instilling the programming that we have in place to bring hope to people, to offer an opportunity for people to transform their lives. And we continue that work today. But a few years into launching the organization, he actually was visiting a prison that had really terrible conditions in Washington State. And the men knew his political background and asked him to take action. And he did. And that's what launched our advocacy work really decades ago. And I see this kind of disconnect for folks in the Christian community sometimes between personal versus systemic, and individual versus systemic, if you will. Like, I have a saying, we want to save souls, but we don't want to save systems sometimes. Or that's beyond kind of the realm of what we're called to do as Christians. And so what we're really trying to do at Prison Fellowship is help Christians understand how our faith values not only should spur us to come visit those who are in prison. There's distinct callings, right? Hebrews 13:3 calls us to go and visit those in prison, to remember those in prison. And in Matthew 25, visit those in prison, right? But that also extends to making sure that we're thinking of the system that is treating those who are visiting unjustly, and the system that often, when people are released, as we talked about earlier, is holding people back from reaching their God-given potential. We should care deeply about changing that if we are Christians. And so I think it's really helping people sort of make that connection from not only bringing hope to individuals through the gospel message, but actually bringing the gospel message to bear on society structures of injustice.
Appreciate that. Jerry, same question, really.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying this. I am a victim of a violent crime. My mother was murdered when I was 5 years old. I grew up not a Christian. I grew up hating God. I didn't believe God existed because I never met my father either. So I grew up with no parents. I came to faith while I was in prison serving a 20-year sentence for drug conviction. And my trauma, along with my crime and all the things, led me, I had to find something. And one of the things that I found out in prison, Black people and white people interpret the Bible different. I knew this in prison. I couldn't articulate it until I read a book. But I came to prison out of my trauma, out of my pain. Out of Christianity, out of my trauma, out of my pain. And what I've realized is that most privileged white America are just, we go to church. We just need to go to church is what we do. But, there's some people who get, they go into trauma and they find God. And, this is just my own personal belief from what I experienced. And so, so when I got out, I lived my life because of my faith. I was told that I was a conservative. So I leaned toward conservative because of my faith. But when I got into those conservative circles, I realized that people were more concerned about the system than Christianity. It was like heritage. And I'm just being raw and real right now. And so I was hurt. I was really hurt. And so now then I find myself in a place of, man, we got all these people who say we love God, but lock them up and throw away the key. Wait a minute. We're supposed to love the Lord thy God with all our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, and our neighbor as ourself. I couldn't get with that. And so I'm still grappling with that. And I think we need to understand, what's going on. When we say we love God, we need to love people, regardless of what a person done. I'm not for, people not being punished, but, I'm the proportionate. I got 20 years for selling drugs. In 6 months, I was cured. I didn't need to do 20 years. I was done in 6 months. And so people of faith need to understand that, especially those people who have really found God and are really living a good life. We need to understand that. And so that's just kind of where I am and kind of where I stand, because that's why my organization is a faith-based organization. Nothing helped me but Jesus Christ. Nothing healed me. Nothing. And he's the only thing that healed me. My faith healed me. My faith allowed me to forgive the man that murdered my mother.
Wow. Matthew, that story sounds familiar to me, knowing you as I do.
Yes, I would say faith plays a great role in it. I ended up accepting Christ as my personal Lord and Savior in 1996, and it changed my life. But I believe, like Kevin has stated as well, a lot of families that have incarcerated loved ones, as well as some of those that are incarcerated, have turned to Christ or have turned to whatever they believe in for hope. Hope is a powerful thing. If you lose that, you lost the most precious thing life could ever offer you anyway. But when it comes to, like I said, some, people feeling, and I wouldn't say necessarily the church, you know what I mean? Because churches understand that we've all been given a second chance. When I say we've all, I'm talking about humanity as a whole. We know that Adam failed, in the Garden of Eden. He did what God had told him not to. And God ended up knowing that he loved us so much that he wanted to give us another chance. So he gave us a second Adam, and that is the Jesus Christ that came. I'm not preaching, but I'm speaking truth. Okay, so therefore, like I said, I see you, Kel. But anyway, through him, we've all been given a second chance. That's my firm belief. So I believe that, the Bible always speaks about giving a person a second chance. The Bible explicitly states that, of course, there is justice, but there's also mercy and grace. Once we start looking at it from a mercy and grace perspective, we can understand that, the law and humanity don't always perfectly get it right. But the law and humanity have to admit when they get it wrong and make moves to change or right the wrongs that they've done. So long as they lean toward that, like I said, there are some people that believe that, if a person commits a crime, they should do the time. I'm one of them that believe that. But I'm one that also got to say we need to put appropriate time in front of that word time, as opposed to just saying time in general, because it's like a person that has never been incarcerated say, give me an example of what you think being locked up for that many years for a crack offense when you could have had a powder or cocaine offense equates to. And I can say, well, if you was driving your car and you ran a stop sign or a stoplight, the police officer stopped you and just took your car from you. You know what I mean? So that just shows the extent of being over-punished if you don't clearly understand it from that perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In these discussions, I have to step in and remind people that we're a nonpartisan organization. But today, I'm going to just remind people we're non-denominational, and I just know how much it means to people, whatever their faith, right, how much it helps them. And I thought that'd be helpful for them to hear that from you all. We only have like 10 minutes left, so I want to talk about the bill a little bit. Heather, do we have a timetable? And also maybe talk about how people can get involved and help.
Absolutely. So timetable. Oh man, Kevin, that's always a depressing question to me. My sister asked me, she's not into politics, and she's like, so how often does a bill pass if you're a lobbyist? And I was like, well, there's this government accountability study out there that says, from introduction to passage, it's about an average of 7 years. And she's like, wow, that's depressing. And it is. But what I will say is, while there's no set timetable, I think that this is a prime opportunity to move a lot faster than that. I think we're expecting to see bipartisan legislation, which will be super helpful, I think, to giving this a trigger of momentum next week in the House. And, while it usually from start to finish, it takes that many years, as we've been discussing today, this issue has been around for a long, long time. People understand that the disparity shouldn't exist. That's why we passed the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act. And so this is about cleaning up those loose ends. And I really believe, with the new administration in and their focus on justice reform, statements that indicate that the administration is supportive of a 1-to-1 ratio, that we could see this move relatively quickly if there's the political will to do it. And so that's why getting involved is so important. That's why FAM and Prison Fellowship have been doing this whole week of action. This is just one of the many things we're doing this week to raise attention to this legislation. And the more people hear about it, and the more that members are likely to prioritize it and then move it through committee and get it passed in both chambers and to the president's desk. And so we'd really encourage you, if you're not already connected to FAM or Prison Fellowship, go to our websites. At Prison Fellowship, we have a Justice Action Center that you can link to where you can sign a letter to your members of Congress and the president about this. I'm sure FAM can share also out their petition and link on this. And, we have a Justice Ambassadors program where people actually volunteer, and we equip you on how you can meet with your lawmakers and have an effective lobby visit, how you can talk about this at your church, if you're a churchgoer, and get other people engaged with you. And so you can apply to the Justice Ambassador program on our website as well, prisonfellowship.org.
Yeah, and I would say you're right. I mean, it's always hard to guess how quickly legislation will pass. And a lot of times Congress makes these big omnibus crime bills that have lots of pieces, and then that gets bogged down. This bill could move on its own as a rifle shot and just fix this one issue. There's both organizations have other goals for this Congress to do other reforms as well, but this is one that we think could get done. And while we're working in Congress, we really want to have a public discussion about this, because people are talking about ways in which bias affects the criminal justice system, and this is really one of the most obvious ways. And if you have friends who are still, reluctant to admit that there's a problem in the system and that there are ways where racial discrimination affects the system, this is a really clear one. And I'm hopeful that once we do our work, we do our education and our advocacy, that the leaders will follow. I think if we do the right thing, what will happen to this bill is what happened in 2010, which is that bill passed unanimously. After years, if not decades, of fighting to convince people there was a problem and having resistance, when the bill finally started to move, it passed unanimously through the House and Senate. And I think we could see that kind of consensus build here if we do our job. So please just get involved, educate your friends and neighbors and family members about this problem, and then we can get a solution. We are almost out of time. This is when I really just like to go around. If there's anything I didn't ask you, or if there's anything you want to say, take a couple minutes and take your shot. And Jerry, I'm going to start with you. It's our first time meeting. Thank you for doing what you're doing. Thanks for what you're doing with your life, and not only what you're doing with us this week on this campaign. So nice to meet you.
Kevin, it is a pleasure meeting you. And Heather, thank you for, I just love being with you. And Matthew, good to see you again. I'm just thankful to be a part of this conversation. Thankful to see that we're moving the needle when it comes to criminal justice reform, and that there are great organizations like Prison Fellowship and FAM who are leading the way. So that's all I want to say. Thank y'all so much for what you're doing.
All right. Thanks. Heather, anything else?
The only thing I forgot to add, just in terms of the momentum building we were just talking about, Kevin, is we're starting to see people come out of the woodwork who are sometimes some surprising characters in terms of who's supporting this. I think, we've got progressive groups supporting this. We've got conservative groups supporting the Equal Act. And even the National District Attorneys Association is actually joining, our organizations for a reporters roundtable next week. And so to see more and more law enforcement groups come out in support of the Equal Act, I think will be super helpful. That's a point you can make to your lawmakers when you're talking with them about this legislation. And please, as I said, your voice does matter. Please make sure you're contacting your lawmakers, whether that's through writing or, if we can equip you to do in a meeting. They really do care what their constituents have to say. And the more you prioritize this, the more they will. So thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. All right, Matthew.
All right. I would just say we know that the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010 was a bipartisan legislation. We know that the First Step Act was as well. We know that we've seen a lot of things when it comes to racial inequities over the past couple of years, you know, the way things have been going in society. But when it comes to the criminal justice system, this is one of those sores that just automatically, you know, stick out from the skin. Everybody can look at it and see that the disparity between the two drug types unfoundly shouldn't be there. But once they actually see that the two drug types are of the same form of drug, just people, you know, of color, you know, maybe more likely are prosecuted for this as opposed to that. I think that the climate is right. I'm hoping that the ratio will be changed to 1-to-1 this year so that we can move on and address other things and other issues that need to be reformed in the criminal justice system, because this should not still be one. But I just want to thank Heather. I want to thank you, Kevin, and also Jerry. And, you know, I'll get on Kevin a little bit in a minute about apologizing. But okay. All right.
Hey, I just want to say thank you to all three of you. I really knew I was going to enjoy this, and I did. If you're watching this through FAM's Facebook channel, I'm sure our staff is posting our petition and our call-in number so you can call your Senate offices. On our webpage, we should have a one-pager about this. Heather and I just published an op-ed in the Hill newspaper. If you're on Twitter, look up the hashtag End the Disparity. There's been a lot of stuff going on this week. We've done Twitter chats that Prison Fellowship has led. So it's really been a great week. We've had encouraging meetings with congressional offices. We'll see if that turns into action. But as Heather said, your voice does matter. It not only matters if your member is not with us and turning them to support us, it makes a difference to make something that they do support a priority. So you want to tell them that you want it done, not just that you support it, but that you want to see action on this. And there's so much fighting going on in Washington right now. There's so many things that the parties are disagreeing about, that this would be something nice that they could do in a bipartisan fashion and actually help people. So we're hopeful that gets done. Thanks again to our guests. Thanks again to our team for putting this together. And we'll see you next week for another edition of the Heart to Heart series. Thank you.